How did Fortnite get to the point where the removal of building, the main attraction to the game, was so celebrated? You may think that this story begins on September 27 with the release of Fortnite Battle Royale. However, 6 years earlier in 2011, Fortnite would be showcased to the world for the first time. In the short trailer, there wasn't any glimpse at the building mechanic the game would later be known for. However, this idea had already been developed. Unreleased footage from the time shows a very primitive version of the game, complete with explosive sledgehammers instead of pickaxes, segways, and of course, burgers. This behind-the-scenes footage showcased a few of the build pieces we'll recognize, however a UI menu that we absolutely will not. This version had 9 different build types, 6 of these being variations of walls with different openings on them, the common straight stairs, a wooden floor, and then the double back stairs, with not a cone in sight. All of these walls appeared to be metal, whereas the floors and stairs were wood, with no brick in sight. You don't need a rocket scientist to know that a construction game should probably have some brick. You may be able to notice that some of the metal walls look slightly different from others, like it was a different type of metal. Images from an Epic Games presentation have shown that there was a potential 4th building material in development, which to me at least looks like it was stronger than metal. We do know, however, for a fact that from the unreleased footage in 2011, there was no brick, no cones, and no editable build pieces. For the next 3 years, there was radio silence on the game. On July 8th, 2014, building was shown to the public for the first time in a video titled Defending the Fort. The concept was relatively simple: build a fort as a defense and stop the husk. Zombies. Rather than the 9 different build pieces that was originally designed, these had been consolidated down into 4: the wall, floor, stair, and cones. The option to then edit these build pieces into other shapes was very proudly shown off in the trailer in the most unrealistic way possible. But what Epic Games hadn't realized is that they had almost accidentally stumbled across one of the most skillful mechanics in gaming history. Over the next few years, Epic Games hosted multiple live streams showcasing the game's development, and for some reason posted a lot about bacon on their social media. Fortnite was eventually released in July of 2017 under the name Fortnite Save the World. The game hit 1 million players in a few months and was a massive success. With the release of Fortnite Battle Royale a few months later in September, Fortnite's brand was about to explode. The free-to-play nature of Fortnite Battle Royale brought players of every skill level to the game, and by every skill level, I mean everyone was horrendous. Battle Royales were massively popular at this time, however all of these were around $20 and riddled with bugs. The main attraction to Fortnite was this quirky new building element from Save the World, but the game was free, and it fit the Battle Royale genre that everyone was so interested in. The first month of its release, despite the main draw being building, the average player couldn't even figure out how to place a wall. So if in the first month you had good aim and you could place a ramp, you were a god among men. Around 1 month into the game's release, a lot of the best players at the time were starting to figure out some of the basic strategies. First came the basic single ramp rush, giving you that high ground advantage and a better angle to aim from. Myth made a full informative video covering this actually in November of 2017, which included some tips on placing walls around your ramp to protect itself and to give you more angles to safely peek from. As crazy as this is to say, barely anyone was doing this at the time, and this video was actually quite revolutionary. At the same time, some players were developing the muscle memory for the defensive wall use when getting shot at. In December, guys like Daquan had this down in the NA Invitational, a tournament I can find absolutely zero information about. There seemed to be a few custom games with some of the biggest names in NA. Placing some walls when you're being shot at sounds like the most obvious play in the world, but he was one of the only players actually doing this at the time, which is probably a large contributor as to why he won both of the games of this event. There really were minimal uses of floors and especially cones at this time, which can be seen here from Day's binds, since he hadn't even optimized these by switching them off of F keys, unlike the ever popular wall and stair. Players were starting to understand how good the high ground advantage was, and similarly most players were just playing for the win, and to do so they needed a defensive position to work with. Well, those hills were too hard to climb up, so the logical next step was to build a 1x1 and pray to Papagerian that you got zone. That developed a bit, but we'll come back to that one. The idea of height advantage started to develop more widespread, and naturally counters also started to develop. Like, just shooting down the ramp. Just a single ramp, it's not that hard. The natural development of this was to place a wall in front of the ramp to stop the ramp from breaking. Well, the Uno reverse card comes out and I'm still just shooting that ramp because it's no more connected. I know what you're thinking. I know the next step in this process. The floor would connect this ramp to the wall, giving it more structural rigidity, and that is the obvious next step. I summon the double ramp wall in attack mode instead. This ended up getting out of hand a little bit, but eventually people started to place stairs, ramps, and then a floor to safely and securely ramp to high ground. Towards the end of 2017, user Lucius Quincitius, I don't know, man, uploaded a clip of Myth fighting another skilled player in-game titled Insane Build Fight, where the two players fought for nearly 3 whole minutes. This video reached over 1.5 million views, showcasing what was considered insane at the time. However, a comment on this video perfectly summarized what was about to happen. It's funny how this was considered an intense build fight 6 months ago. In Season 3, major improvements were made to building. For controller players, the option of Builder Pro was added, meaning you no longer had to manually cycle between build pieces like you do weapons, and now there was a bind for each one. But most impactful of all was the addition of Turbo Build. Turbo Build allows you to continuously place the selected building pieces by holding down the place button. This allowed for a rapid acceleration of players' skills, given the number of builds they could place per second was multiplied by about 10. The implementation of this feature was hugely celebrated at the time, as building became significantly easier since you no longer had to individually click place for each building piece. However, this would inherently raise the skill gap of the game, a change that Epic Games would later try to revert. Shortly after this, in Season 4, Epic would make probably the second most impactful change in the game's history, the introduction of Playground Mode. Previously, if players wanted to practice, they'd have to stream snipe each other, harvest materials in Wailing Woods, and then 1v1. With the introduction of Playground Mode, there was finally a place that players could practice their mechanical abilities, and practice they did. Top players at the time spent a huge percentage of their time 1v1ing each other, learning and improving from the best of the best, an advantage a lot of the average players who just wanted a victory royale did not have. This, in combination with the addition of Turbo Build, was just the beginning of the best players separating themselves from the average. The 90, 180, and side jumps all started to become common practice in the top players, and eventually even cones. Who would have thought? Up until this point, cones were basically never used. People would unbind cones, they pretty much only used them to cross Loot Lake or to pre-edit them backwards to walk down ramps, but a select few had found the secret power and were keeping it under wraps.
So, like, who invented the cone? Like, who cares? Because at the end of the day, like, it's all about who popularizes it, really. Right? Like Hamlin's popularized coning with that video.
Indeed, it was Hamlin's who popularized coning initially, and many pros started to expand on this at this point. Has made a tutorial on how to cone and what he called a King Tut. The name didn't catch on. Throughout the rest of 2018, the build fight and cone meta continued to climb in skill level, particularly with the release of Creative in December, which made practicing even easier. Whilst the average skill was increasing vertically, the best of the best were already far ahead of the curve down low. The counter to players building up was so obvious. Don't follow them. And so, box fighting was born. Come World Cup qualifiers in 2019, there were a few players that were ahead of the rest when it came to wall-to-wall fighting. Unknown Army was hands down one of the best players at phasing into players' boxes by placing a ramp over his head and breaking through the wall at the time it's broken, whereas players like Clicks were beginning to popularize the wall replace, being able to replace an opponent's wall with his own so that you could edit it and shoot the opponent. At the same time as this was going on, a few select players had progressed far above the rest and were just scratching the surface of Peace Control. I won't say that Booga was the creator of Peace Control, but he absolutely was the first to capitalize on its abilities. He was one of the first few who at the end of Chapter 1 was ahead of the curve and was able to place builds ahead of other players and trap and box them. Prior to this, the mainstream player base would really only box players in an attempt to place traps on the wall and get easy eliminations, but players like Booga were able to think one step ahead of their opponents and place his own builds in front of them to prevent their escape. Wall replacing, Peace Control, build and box fights started to become much more common towards the end of Chapter 1 Season 9 of Fortnite. Epic understood that the skill gap of the game was steadily increasing, and casual players were starting to complain about the sweats. Their attempt to remedy the situation did not go well. In patch version 10.20 of Season X, Epic altered the turbo build time from 0.005 seconds to 0.15 seconds. So if you're holding a wall, for example, this went from theoretically being able to place 200 walls a second to just under 7. This is equivalent to playing on 150 millisecond ping. and quite frankly, made the game feel horrible. The response was not good. The justification for this change was that they felt rapid turbo building favors players with low ping in disproportionate ways when playing defensively and when taking walls, and that they wanted building to be more deliberate. All of those are definitely valid concerns for the game, but this is just absolutely not the correct solution, and thankfully it was reverted. At the end of Chapter 1, the average casual player could still keep up to an extent, but a lot of the players who couldn't really build that well were starting to get frustrated with the game and losing interest, something that would continue to plague the game for years to come. The release of Chapter 2 got a lot of the casual players reinvested in the game with a brand new map to work with, and bots had been added to pubs so that low-skilled players could get a thrill of winning. Similarly, the competitive players were happy too. The meta had no wacky items in it, and it was pretty bare bones, meaning really everyone was happy. However, towards the end of the season, competitive tournaments and discussion suddenly stopped, for months. The future of competitive was unclear, but the competitive players needed something to do. This is the point in time where I truly believe the skill gap grew the largest, and it was all thanks to one move, the peanut butter peak. Up until this point, the entire foundation of modern building and editing mechanics had been laid. Build fighting, box fighting, wall replacing, cone slides, and piece control, but one thing it lacked was the ability to do all of this with speed, precision, and of course, from a safe angle. With no tournaments to play, pretty much all of the competitive players flocked to creative. If at some point between December 2019 to February 2020 you logged onto Twitch, clicked on the Fortnite category, there was only one thing you would see: box fights. Box fights everywhere. If Mama Benji Fishy was playing back then, she'd be streaming 2v2 box fights. Players of every rank wanted to play box fights. The level of proficiency that players had when it came to wall-to-wall combat skyrocketed. When tournaments eventually returned in Chapter 2 Season 2, a worldwide event happened that I can't name or this video will get demonetized, meaning that everyone was at home. This meant that for months, players were playing more than ever, and the average skill level over the next few seasons would explode to new heights. It was at this point the skill gap was so high that even many pros struggled to keep up. Players like Poach, Tfue, Cloaksy, Chap, 72 Hours, Nick Mercs to name a few, had slowly fallen behind the pack and could no longer keep up.
I'm a shark, okay? But then there's megalodons, and there's a bunch of megalodons now, and the megalodons eat me.
There are of course other factors that went into these players quitting the game, but it's no coincidence that these players all fell behind mechanically prior to quitting. On top of this, Fortnite had more competition than ever, with Warzone releasing in March and Valorant releasing in June of 2020. It really was no surprise that a large amount of players were drawn to these games and away from Fortnite. The same could be said from the casual side. Lots of streamers who had been with the game for a long time, like Tim the Tatman, Courage JD, and Ninja, all made a switch to other games around this time. Now this sounds very doom and gloom, but this was inevitable. Epic Games created the building and editing aspects in an interesting twist on the tower defense genre of games, but almost accidentally created what would be one of the most skilled mechanics in PvP gaming history. If you were a competitive player who put in the work, this is an aspect you love. But it seemed like the game was losing its casual approach to an extent, and it's hard just to hop on and have fun if you can't win a single fight against a real player. Something needed to be done. As the seasons in Chapter 2 went by, Epic's solution to this seemed to be to cater to the casual player base more and more. This meant giving them more powerful spray weapons, items that did damage through build structures, and vehicles to counter the players that could build and were skilled at the game. For the most part, these changes were kept out of competitive. As the seasons went on, the skill of the average player continued to rise. Players who didn't have time to play 8 hours a day now played a few hours a day, but for years, and are all relatively skillful. There weren't many new fighting styles developed over this time, but the strong foundations that had already been laid were just being built off of. Piece control, box fighting, and proper peaks had all been done for a long time, and players were relatively proficient, but as time progressed through Chapter 2, top pros and average players all got significantly better at it, to the point where your average arena player had good piece control. With the release of Fortnite Chapter 3, it seemed only logical that a lot of new players would be drawn to the game, and a lot of older, less skilled players that had left would come back. Epic really needed something to capitalize on this influx of players and keep them around. In the first few days of Chapter 3 Season 2, public matches had no building, which eventually turned into a permanent separate playlist. The competitive community, of course, was initially freaking out as they put their time and effort in developing their mechanical skills for it just to be taken away, but thankfully, this didn't impact the competitive playlists. The reception was surprisingly amazing. The huge skill gap in building and editing is what competitive players love about Fortnite, but this is daunting for newer players and can make them leave the game. With the addition of the permanent no-build playlist, these new players now have a place where they can learn the basics of the game and hopefully stick around.